The United States is in a state of confusion and surprise.
We fear this. We fear that they have something out that the majority of the people don't know about.
Olan tüm halkların hakları gibi haklar. Ne aşağı ne yukarı, ne fazla ne az.
Pent-up feelings that may result from decades of repression and people who've had members of their family killed by that regime.
A lot of killers. Get a lot of killers. Why, you think our country's so innocent?
But I won't attack it because someone sicks me off. I don't let anybody use me to fight their battles.
Good evening. Welcome to Varn blog. And I'm doing another solo recording where I risk a geopolitical analysis with a prediction. I'm always hesitant to offer predictions because we should be careful about gaming the future. After all, in the past 3 weeks, how many of us have eaten crow, not just by the day, but sometimes by the hour? It's been discrediting to so many people that I otherwise respect. And these ideas are not just my own. They come out of the conversations I've had with people like Dr. Kuba Wingdowski, Pascal Robert, Esri from Swampside, my political analysis group. There's much to say here. Also, some of what I've said has been already expanded on in a Twitter thread that you can find on my Twitter handle down there. But I'm going to go into more detail here. My prediction is that the peace talks may go better tomorrow because the Pentagon won't risk invoking Article 5 if Poland were to get attacked for sending MiGs to Ukraine. Furthermore, it's become clear that Europe will not forego all Russian energy, even though it's already going to take a loss. And I'll get back to that in a minute. So the Ukrainian leadership must realize it's in its interest to agree to most of the terms, including Finlandization, in order to have a say on the meaning of denazification, sacrificing the Adar and Azov battalions would not be a big loss. And for Zelensky, may even remove some of the people who may be willing to assassinate him once this is all over. But that's not to say it's going to happen. If this does happen, Israel, China, France, and Turkey will be the most likely and happy to lead the peace negotiations, as Turkey is already playing a major role, as is Israel. People may not have noticed, but while Turkey has been much more loyal to NATO for reasons of its own geopolitical concerns in North Africa and the Middle East, Israel has been a much more cagey operation, with the prime minister going to visit Putin more than once. And as it is dealing with Jewish Ukrainians and Russians coming into the country. The U.S. may be largely shut out of these negotiations, and even if it is there, it's unlikely to have a big sway. Biden will have difficulty explaining the situation to the general public in America, too, and for reasons of its press being both over-optimistic about Ukrainian likelihood of success, and perhaps not entirely honest about the actual threat of nuclear war. In some ways, to keep people calm and showing support, I've even noticed that, as my friend Pike Bishop pointed out, the New York Times omitted some discussions of nuclear exchange that happened in Congress. So the smarter set amongst the U.S. intellectua will realize that we never intended to help Ukraine. and start asking why we risked our rhetoric. While this was a rehabilitation of the US military intelligence community, as it was right about Russia in a way that most people didn't predict, after all, even I thought the most likely scenario was that we'd have a repeat of the Georgia situation with Russian troops solidifying the separatist republics. Sure, this will also solidify Putin's legacy if the peace talks go well. He'll be able to groom a successor with this victory in his basket. And yes, the economic price has been severe and will probably be severe for a while. While some of the sanctions will start slowly disappearing as soon as the public isn't noticing. The economic damage has been done, but Putin will have his claim to his multipolar world in the restoration of something like the Russian world and Ruski Mir, the Russian sphere of influence. And a real claim to it at that. Furthermore, he will have forced most of the former BRICS countries back into cooperation, with Brazil under Bolsonaro spinning away from the US orbit and back towards India and China. Sure, Venezuela will have improved relations with the US if Congress doesn't mess it up, but that's a small price to pay. In the long term, the US will pump more oil and Venezuela will put more of its oil on the market. But in the immediate term, Biden must go kiss the ring of the princes and the Emiratis, as his attempt at a humanitarian effort in Yemen will have scuttled his ability to ask much from bin Salman. If you think this multipolar world will be good for small countries, I assure you, ask Yemenis how this is likely to go for them. I don't say this because I like any side. I don't wave flags or pick sides in nation states. And I defend the people that I live with because I live with them, not because of some abstract notion of nationhood. This whole situation has been horrible and stupid. And all sides are to blame. And if you don't believe me, it goes all the way back to Yanukovych's bluff, trying to bait the EU to give an offer to sweeten the pot with Russia. If he had not done that, the fissure that caused Euromaidan to open up and caused the right in the Ukraine to be able to really assert itself in politics, over-assert itself, leading to a neoliberal center in Zelensky, would have never have happened. But Biden had his political calculus here too. He had an attempt to redeem the U.S. intelligence agency, which since the Yugoslav wars has been making almost ludicrous mistakes, from bombing the Chinese embassy in Serbia all the way to the fiascos of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, the last of which Biden oversaw himself, and was a big hit to his popularity here, despite the fact leaving Afghanistan itself was a very popular proposition. So in Biden's vision, because the Democrats have failed on all their domestic politics, this gave him a chance to redeem the NATO ghouls, to get the war hawks back in public, but to cost no American lives. Because the limits on what even the Pentagon would risk to save Ukrainians are low. All the wagging, none of the dog. And we saw it in a near instant poll boost. And Biden's most right-wing speech, his recent State of the Union address, being broadly popular. I suppose that he thought Ukraine, which had done better than anyone expected, would fight until Kyiv was like Baghdad in 2003. Not a vision I particularly want to see, or any Ukrainian I know either. But instead, he gets an energy crisis and adds fuel to the fire of inflation at home. Now, this deal is not done. Putin may not want to give in so easily as some people have told me. Although I think people who think that's like a concession to NATO and the West are being somewhat ridiculous, as he would be able to boast that he saved Russian lives, neutralized Ukraine, and freed the Russian people of Crimea and the two separatist republics. There are forces in both Russia and Ukraine, though, that will want more than this, and either side is likely to give. The nationalists in Ukraine will probably consider all the peacemakers traitors, and there will be more and more people on their side as so many people have died. But you should look at the ghoulish forces outside of China and all this. China, for whatever criticism you want to make of it, and there are many valid criticisms, China's played a game in which all sides need it, and it will be the gateway between the increasingly independent spheres and flows of capital, with equal or even more say than the US. Not just does it have the production power now, but it can honestly say to have achieved near hegemony, or at least regional hegemony, without the violence of the rest's 19th and 20th century wise. This does not mean that I think that China is on particularly stable ground in the long game. Xi has been consolidating his rule in the Politburo, and there are factions in the Chinese Politburo that I understand have very conservative views on culture and national relations. And Xi has been playing a balancing act, but consolidating power into fewer and fewer hands. Deng's oligarchical Politburo has been increasingly under a unitary executive, although how unitary is unclear to me. It's not something I can actually speak on. There are clearly different factions within the Communist Party. Clearly different factions, both ideologically and regionally. But not ideologically in the sense of capitalist versus communist, but ideologically in the sense of their orientation towards how they think China should handle the various divisions, natures, and conflicts of the world. As the Chinese know, they will not exist under the same unique conditions in which the United States and its transatlantic superstate after World War II existed. There will be no repeat of a country with 52% of the world's wealth, or 49% in the world's wealth, in the hands of less than 15% of the world's public. Ukraine will likely be poorer for the whole affair, not just because it has to rebuild and move on, regardless of what happens in these peace talks, but because there is almost no way it can integrate into NATO without risking further battles with Russia. And this is a conventional war. While an insurgent war could easily turn into the Balkans or Iraq for the Russians, which is another reason why I think they may be playing their hand differently. It's clear to me that in a conventional war, the Clausewitzian rules do still apply. They may have broken up Russia's game, but Russia has held back many of its more advanced forces. And while it's been throwing more and more troops at Ukraine, and Ukraine has performed better than anyone expected and consolidated more than anyone expected, there is a real sense that without NATO willing to risk a no-fly zone and thus worldwide nuclear war, or at least Europe risking a very cold winter, that they are, in the long run, doomed. Furthermore, even if Ukraine is in the Eurasian orbit, outside of China, many people, many countries simply will not have the money to help them. Such is the way of the world after the Chicago boys had their way. After all, the Chicago boys did make sure that the most production that Russia would do was autarkist, and even then, not really. One of the resource richest countries in the world dipped itself into an extractive economy. And even though it has still to this day good universities and powerful people, people still confuse it from its Soviet period. If you were to believe Putin on anything, believe him about what the Chicago boys did to Russia and how it changed the nature of the situation there. This is not to say that this victory will be a victory for the left in Russia either, although peace will be a victory for anyone, and you'll see some semblance of the return to civil society. But Putin will have consolidated his power in united Russia, and no one should be foolish enough to believe that even in Russian terms, that united Russia is a left-wing party. In fact, his speech at the beginning of this war makes it clear that while he may be willing to take on Stalin's legacy after 1929, he wants to erase the legacy of the USSR. So all my boys with their red star hats should probably be a little more wary than they are. Domestically, this is a bad situation for the Democrats. The Dems will only have the COVID response, which they managed to turn to a culture war in response to the Republicans turning it into a culture war. Because they cannot say that they followed the science. The CDC has been tilting at the whims of executive prerogatives. Furthermore, the vaccine culture wars became a culture war within the vacciners to vax, boost, and done to those who wanted maximal COVID protections nearly forever. But it's funny how fast that all ends. In the middle of this period, Biden declares COVID over, tells us all to go back to the office on the day in which we've had in absolute numbers the most expensive gas in American history. I realize when you adjust for real numbers, real values, that yes, it was slightly higher under the Bush administration at the height of the Iraq war period, but let's be real for a minute. No one really cares about those comparisons. So what does the Democrats have to show for their first 2 years? An initial COVID response, a tax credit they couldn't maintain, a bipartisan post office bill, the relaunching of neoconservatives under their name and tricking some liberals into not realizing that calling for a no-fly zone with a nuclear power could live in an Armageddon. The 7-point boost Biden enjoyed will likely go away, and the Dems will try to run on their budget surplus that they have been gearing up for right now. For those of you who don't know what this means, I'll come back to it in a minute. Let me talk about the left in America for a second. While the left in so many other places has been liquidated between COVID and now this, and discredited as well, the left in America, and so much that anyone cares about such a marginal and modal group of perpetual losers, both electorally and apparently morally, has proven itself ineffective. Not only did it, and the only boost the Dems got from this was a return to the Cold War status, but that status is clear since they never intended to help Ukraine for risk of a world war. So what does the left do? It's failed on Medicare for all. It's failed on foreign policy. It had no clear agenda. Its organizations are hemorrhaging members, both from the stasis of long periods of COVID, but also because they have no national direction other than electoral politics, which has been shown not to matter. After all, anyone who did basic mathematic calculations and looked at risk and rewards and incentives are even the most basic of game theory, would see that the right wing of the Democrats always had an advantage because they have a camp to defect to and still have an electoral sway and maybe even hold on to their local electorates. The left wing has nowhere to go. And that capture has not changed since the McGovern campaign. The Great Realignment has not so much been a realignment towards the left, despite all the socialist rhetoric and things you may see on Twitter. It has been a realignment back towards the old ghouls. Let's go to this budget surplus that the Dems will likely run on. It is a time bomb. Every time we run a budget surplus, which does not actually necessarily mean the deficit, it leads to credit bubbles. And if the Fed goes ahead with the interest rate hikes to battle the cost push inflation, which it wouldn't fix anyway, as it has said it was going to do, and the Dems and Biden allows the student loans to hit the general public at the high point of inflation, the Dems will have overseen more austerity than most recent Republican administrations. Instead of raising people out of poverty from their talking points just a year ago, they will be plunging people back into it. The Dems then will likely try to re-kick off their semi-Cold War with China, blaming them for being too soft on Russia as Ukraine agrees to terms, all while knowing that the Pentagon wouldn't let them risk World War III anyway. After all, the president's press secretary is already pushing these talking points on Twitter. Again, all the wagging, none of the dog. Now, this only makes sense that the Dems have no attention or ability to deliver on any of their reform efforts, and that the left thinks that if it can double down and give it one more good college try like it has every round of defeats since 1936, that we'll be able to go and get again. But it hasn't looked at the conditions. There's no Soviet Union on the horizon. There's no mass workers movement, and no one has even begun to figure out how to do it. I recently read The Left in Purgatory, and I saw all the right questions answered and then asked and then studiously avoided being answered. So the left, be it progressive or social democratic or democratic socialist, has acted as a controlled opposition, much like the Tea Party before it, or the McGovern campaign before that. Much like the anti-war movement did. It has been so easily gameable, and its leaders so morally shocked when it did not happen, and yet they continued to go on unpunished for their foolishness. And what has it built? Well, lots of media careers, as I've pointed out over and over again in the last month, but little else. And now, this was a gambit before you praise anyone's political genius. After all, it gave NATO's intelligence services a victory, resurrected the War Ghouls, and they're not going to go away overnight just if this war does. In fact, they will double down on Biden for not being hawkish enough and blame him for not sending more planes in, knowing full well that no one in the Pentagon would have risked a nuclear Armageddon. Several world economies will be worse off, and I will talk about Europe in a minute. And Russia will have paid a price in its reputation, even if it has solidified its victories here. But I hope you didn't believe all the media talk of Putin being insane. While this act was hubristic, it also wasn't irrational. It was just bloody-minded and venial. All this was quite possibly unnecessary and has unfolded from the litany of big men making bigger mistakes for the past 15 years. 20, 30 years even. And during all this time, many of us have been wrong, including me, both on the likelihood of the severity of military actions, how any side will perform, etc. I was surprised at how hard the Ukrainians fought, but I've also been surprised at how much people were willing to use that to believe that the traditional calculuses of war just did not apply. But I was not wrong that NATO was likely going to leave the Ukrainians out to dry. This leaves me with an interesting bit of praise that people might be surprised at this commentary. Zelensky seems to be an actual hero who would rather admit a kind of defeat and save part of his country and who knows how many Ukrainian and even Russian lives than continue to let smoke be blown up his ass by the US and other allies as eastern Ukraine is turned into bloody rubble. Yes, they'll fight on. Yes, they'll have every incentive to hate the Russians for the rest of the lifetime of these next two generations, and they probably will. And I would not want to be a Russian speaker in Western Ukraine. Who knows? You might even see Ruthenian and Galatian nationalist movements come up out of this. If he is lucky and the most vicious of the Ukrainian nationalists don't take him out afterwards, he will likely have little to show for this act that he might do, but shame. And this truly saddens me. The seemingly neoliberal clown really did have a spine, was willing to go down with the ship, and may even be willing to admit that he was led astray by the West. A rare quality among leaders these days, and one that I dare say probably won't be rewarded. In the meanwhile, everywhere in the world, Mike Davis's Thanatos Triumphant still rings true. Even in democracies, things are less democratic. The Republicans' use of one element of the unelected state to fight another element of the unelected state, aka the deep state versus the judicial state, has led to what is likely to be a less and less democratic electoral system here in the States. Centrist powers, be they the Tories in the UK or the Liberals in Canada, seem to be somewhat unassailable. And the trucker convoys' use of a wartime measure, the use of a wartime measure to fight the trucker convoy will have implications that many people do not understand and do not realize how severe they are in Canada. They probably won't be used, but now they have precedent for them. It is funny how a little bit of frustration will cause many people to act not in their self-interest because they don't understand entirely what is being done. It is in their immediate self-interest, and it is not because they are stupid. It is because they often do not know all the implications, and the press in almost every country I know fails in this responsibility. The US will continue to fight itself as it has wasted its flashpan hegemony before it even completely consolidated it. Not even a generation after the fall of the Soviet Union, you can already see things fraying from our hubris. And the US public will be madder at itself because few want to deal with the fact that they have almost no control. Protests, riots, bloviating, paranoid conspiracy movements, hashtags. Very little has changed anything. And whether you call someone a rhino or a dino, the center of power has maintained the same, whether Obama, Trump, the outsider candidates, the restoration of normalcy under Biden, none of this has worked. And all Americans seem to distrust democracy more and more, but still believe they hold democratic norms. And they keep on getting gamed by our two-party system. And for those who say, oh, we just need a third party, you should look at the laws and see how since Ross Perot that has become a harder and harder possibility electorally. After all, you have to change the laws, not just at the federal level, but at all 50 states. We have changed little here because we have used the wrong levers and we have not known the right levers of which to learn. Make no mistake, if this is peace, it will be a good thing. It is better than sacrificing any more Ukrainians on the altar of a failed globalization, any more Russians on the altar of a cultural myth. But most of us live such double thought lives, and we can't blame any people totally for being so misled. After all, most of us are too. And it takes the shock of leaving one's own context for it to be apparent. But in the long run, things are more brittle everywhere and more complex. And complexity and fragility, when the efficiency is not there, will often lead to more and more Bonapartism, more and more irrational calculations, more and more and more. And so much of the world's future will depend on the opaque politics within China, politics that most of us do not know and play no part in. While China has been the most responsible actor, it is always wrong to assume that the current conditions will stay the same. But if you want a better future, if you want a different future, you have to admit the present you are in, not the present you want to be in. And this leads me to Europe. The war drum has been beaten, as my friend said, for the past weeks. And even I have noticed that British papers have even been more hawkish and bellicose, whether they be liberal or conservative, than American ones. An Irish friend of mine has told me that many people have started talking about this as a good war, like the one to aid out plucky Belgium. And that the only solution is an insurgency to negotiate a good peace. And this has left the small country a plaything. And if you think Laclane will be the only or the last one, or even the last one in Europe, I beg you to rethink that. The Ukrainians know that they fight this alone. And Europe was just as much of a player in that as the US. Plus, Europe's economy has a double-edged sword of its own sanctions. The shooting of the Nord 2 pipeline and only LGN exports to the European economy from the US as a boon. In the short run, it has been great for US geopolitics in the region, consolidating Europe behind the Atlanticist mode once again. Although in the long run, it's yet to see if Germany will live up to its rearmament and that Germany and France will agree that maybe it's time to look at European spheres of influence and pay for their own defense. But who knows? Furthermore, as I said and have hinted throughout, this prediction could all be wrong. Zelensky could decide that they could fight for better conditions and fight harder. Or maybe the nationalists take him out before he has a chance to. I mean, he's a nationalist himself in his neoliberal way, but he was always a centrist, which is something many Americans miss when they talk about, the brave freedom fighter, or, frankly, when people throw the accusations of Nazi government at every part of the Ukrainian apparatus and not just elements of the military. This is a game that I think people should be wary of, because if you look at anyone's security services, you will see there are plenty of Nazis in it, are the equivalent thereof, or reactionaries, or Islamists, fill in the blank. And while many will notice that reactionaries often recognize their similarities tactically, they often have enough different tactical outcome goals, however, that their long-term viability isn't there, which is not the case with a lot of the left, which never agrees on anything tactically or strategically, but does ultimately often agree on its long-term allegiance. But we should not be talking about anyone who speaks for the left anymore, probably anywhere on earth, particularly on a channel like this one. I don't speak for anyone but me, and I'm willing to say that I don't know that any of my predictions today are right. They just seem to me much what is most likely, given what we have seen in the last few hours. I have not listened to any lay analysis of this war that has not ventured something wrong. And the stakes are high for everyone, even for Putin. Do not misread that. If this war becomes a long, drawn-out slog, if it becomes another Afghanistan or an Iraq, then Putin's consolidation of power will definitely be at risk. But we don't know what anyone's calculus is, and we've all been wrong. Almost no one predicted the beeline to Kyiv but Michael Kaufman. And watching people turn on the foreign policy realists has been difficult. I've always listened to realists, not because I believe in them or share their imperialist worldview, but because they view nation states as what they are. The committees of various national working classes often set at odds in each other, and what we would call the myth of the state of nature, a war of all against all for resources, abstractified and without conscience because they are abstractified. I hope some of you grow up and create better political movements from what you learn from this. I hope some of you quit thinking that standing this or that great power will give you anything, or that some facile notion of uniting left and right, or this, that, and the other is anywhere to go, or that the current left is worth a shit. I mean, honestly, the liberal left has struck me as particularly incompetent administrators of empire. Ones that will deserve a lot of what they get in the upcoming elections here. But what will replace them? Probably nothing anybody will like. Our moment of hope, and I want to always end on one lately because it can be too dark otherwise, is that crows are coming home for a lot of people. And people will start being disillusioned. Maybe it's time to figure out if we could offer them something far more real than the bullshit they've been sold the last 2 decades. And with that, good night.